youngest son is a sophomore in high school, and he's taking his first advanced placement class in history. And one of the things that he is learning is the old notion of compare and contrast. If you've ever taken history courses, I was a history major as an undergrad. Seems like you spend an enormous amount of time doing that. And that's how we're going to kick off this talk. Compare and contrast. So we're going to talk about Europe. So instead, we'll talk about the United States first. This is the United States. And one of the key features of the United States inside that red area there, now part of that does go up into Canada, but that is one of the world's most fertile breadbaskets. It is some of the best farmland on the planet. And the other factor that makes that farmland so incredibly important is that there is a very useful river system that allows that grain to come to market, not just to the US markets, but eventually to the world. Which actually means that for a significant part of our history, the most important city in the country was not there, but here, New Orleans. Because if you can control New Orleans, you could shut that river system down. Now the other, besides being in the middle of the country and able to be transported, which was a huge benefit because there are other parts of the world that can grow grain, but they can't get it to market. Russia's kind of a classic example. The other thing the United States did was first, our forefathers pushed our northern border far enough to where the Canadians pretty much got most of the inhospitable land. It's cold, and you can't support a huge population. And then in the South, we did kind of something similar. We encouraged the Texans to rebel against the Mexicans so we could protect New Orleans, and then eventually push them far south enough to where they couldn't become a threat. We were surrounded by two large oceans, which meant that we were safe. In other words, we created a situation where we were in an extraordinarily stable situation. We could control our country, and we could take care of ourselves, and we could control the whole thing. Now let's contrast that with Europe. First off, Europe's got this island out here called the British Isles. It includes Britain and Ireland, although the Irish have had their issues with that. This island is never strong enough to control the continent, but it's strong enough to where the continent can't control it. It's not that people haven't tried. Hitler tried to bomb them into submission. The French tried to invade on a couple of occasions. But no one's ever really been able to pull it off since 1066. That means that that country will always be independent of the continent and a thorn in its side. Secondly, there's this mountain range down here called the Pyrenees, which isolates the Iberian Peninsula from the rest of the continent. The Scandinavians are also off there on their own because they have this sea that separates them from the continent. And then there's a couple of mountain ranges, the Alps and the Carpathians, that also isolate the continent. So effectively, the geography of Europe prevented any country in Europe from controlling that continent. And this may be one of the great tragedies of human history, that no country was ever able to get complete control over Europe because the talented and smart and aggressive and ambitious people of that continent effectively could not get along with each other because they were all trying to control their neck of the woods. Now, in this mix becomes the problems of the poor Germans. And through the magic of PowerPoint, we will show that the Germans face threats from both sides. The Russians from the east and the French from the west. And they had good reason to control Germany because Germany sits here in the middle and it has all the makings of a strong powerhouse. Economically, they can sell to both sides. They have river systems. You'll notice it's pretty flat. It's also indefensible. It really can't protect itself against an invader from the east or the west. And so as it formed as a country in the 1870s, it then tried to create conditions in its war planning to where it could protect itself from invasion. So in World War I, they had the Sheffield Plan, and its goal was to hold off the Russians and knock out the French. It failed at the River Marne, and World War I devolved into trench warfare. In World War II, Hitler learned the lessons of World War I and did a non-aggression pact with the Soviets. The Soviets did this not because they were stupid, but because they figured the same thing would happen. The Germans would invade France, they'd get bogged down, and then the Russians could eventually come in and invade. In their wildest dreams, they didn't think that Hitler would overthrow France quickly, and then eventually Hitler turned back on that. But effectively, you have a continent here that's wealthy, that's ambitious, and that no one can control, and they all die fighting to control them. So, what's the goal of Europe? Well, it's the same goal we all have, peace and prosperity. So after the Second World War, European leaders were bound and determined not to fight a third world war on European soil. So goal number one was to stop another war from being fought in Europe. Whoop, come back here. Secondly, they wanted to recover from the devastation of the Second World War. And third, they wanted to create conditions that would ensure European relevance. This had been the country that empires were built from, that were all falling apart. The British were seeing their empire fall apart after the Second World War. The French were as well. Whereas really hit home was 1956 in the Suez crisis, when President Eisenhower informed the British that if they didn't withdraw their troops, we would withdraw their bonds. And they couldn't stand the economic downturn from that, so they had to effectively cave to U.S. demands. They wanted to create a situation of European unity so they would remain relevant. See, here's the thing that's interesting. This is the share of global GDP of the big four of Europe: Germany, Italy, Britain, and France. In 1820, this represented about 17.5% of global GDP. The Industrial Revolution occurred, and by the 1870s, these four countries represented over a quarter of the global economy. After the First World War, however, the decline set in and it accelerated. This is what they were trying to fight. It didn't work out so well. So, how do they avoid World War III? Well, the concern was that Europeans were nationalistic, that the Italians, the Germans, the French, the Danes all thought of themselves as separate national entities, and that needed to be suppressed. That was felt like nationalism was the cause of these wars. There's some great quotes from Albert Einstein suggesting this. And that this natural expression had to be suppressed somehow. National identities remained strong because of that geography. The Italians were isolated due to mountains. The Spaniards were as well. The Germans were still afraid. In fact, after the Second World War, the way we fixed the German problem was to split Germany in half. The fear was that nationalism would eventually bring another conflict. So, European leaders concluded that national identities were too strong to be eliminated. Instead, they were going to try to subsume nationalism with economic growth and recovery. So, much like Adolf Huxley's Brave New World, don't worry about this, just worry about making stuff, making money, rebuilding the continent, and not having another war. Now, they weren't stupid. They knew that it was a bit of a long shot, but it was the best shot they had. The other thing that they did was they outsourced their military to the United States through NATO. So Europe's national spending on defense is supposed to be about 2% of its GDP. It rarely hits that with any of these countries. The Libyan operation we recently saw showed that France and Britain, probably the two strongest militaries in Europe, were unable to operate a fairly benign no-fly zone in a fourth-rate military in northern Africa. Economic growth and prosperity would be used as a replacement for national identity. So instead of being French, you thought of yourself as European because it meant you had more stuff. Now, the elites realized this was a long shot, but they still thought it was the best solution available because they were terrified of fighting another war. And hope was that Europeans would opt for peace and prosperity over national identity. Europe went from being the venue of global power to the friction point between the United States and the Soviet Union, and they didn't like this. So to maintain relevance, European, and the correct term there for European is French, leaders wanted to use the combined economic might of Europe to boost its global standing. France proposed, and the West Germans paid. A lot. Now the Germans are dictating, and the French are like, please, don't hurt me, Angela. So what was their solution? It was the EU, the European Economic Union. It started off as a steel and coal union between Germany and France. It steadily expanded to include more nations and aspects of European life, telling you what you can put in your cheese, how to make your beer, who you can let in your country and who you can't. The French wanted to use this as a platform to leverage its influence and use the EU for that purpose. The solution generally worked. We did not fight a Third World War in Europe. Germany persistently transferred monies to the rest of the EU and it steadily grew. Now, the European elites were committed to this unification project because they feared a relapse would result in nationalism and another war. That's why you see these comments from Angela Merkel and other European officials that say, you know, if the euro fails, it won't be long and things will get bad again. Now, given the state of the European militaries, it's hard to imagine that they could hurt themselves. However, what the Germans showed in the 1930s, even after economic devastation, if your officer corps is strong, you can rebuild. If you're an industrial country, you can rebuild the military very quickly. So they do have a good reason to fear this. By the way, this is a interesting demographic issue as well, because the young folks in Europe are much less driven by this. They're more nationalistic and less worried about wars than their parents and grandparents, because they didn't experience that. The crowning achievement was the euro. Create a single currency that they would all use. This would bind them together. It would bring the continent together. The French pushed for the euro as a trade-off for German unification. They were vehemently opposed to German unification because they were afraid that this new Germany would be an economic powerhouse. It's actually kind of funny now that we look back on it, but at the time, in 1989, 1990, you looked at it and said, my God, the pinnacle of communist economics, East Germany is going to join with this Western German powerhouse and make this great economic country. Actually, what we found out, the East Germans didn't have a whole lot, and the West Germans have spent about 5 or 6 years trying to build them back. But that was the goal, to bring this continent together. Initially, it's 12 nations. It's now grown to 17. It's a significant economic bloc, but the problem is the euro rests on a concept in foreign policy called strategic ambiguity. What is strategic ambiguity? We'll get to that. To ensure the nations wouldn't take advantage of the single currency by being fiscally irresponsible, rules were established called the Maastricht Treaty. But there is a cultural perception of rules. Where I discovered this, I used to be a Jesuit, and at one point, in fact, I may be living here in Denver, a rule came out of Rome, and we were all like, boy, this is really a hard rule. One of my older colleagues said, he said, the thing you got to remember is that Anglo-Saxons view rules as minimum requirements. And the Romantic countries tend to view rules as things you should aspire to. Now, strategic ambiguity is a really useful tool in foreign policy. We engage in strategic ambiguity with Taiwan. We both say, both Chinese and the United States, that there's only one China. And of course, mainland China feels like they are it. And we kind of know they're it, but we still say, but Taiwan could be it too. I've heard tell that it's actually pretty effective in marriages too. But occasionally, things do come up that force the issue, and that's what's happening with the euro. Because you can't necessarily get away with this indefinitely. See, the euro rests on a strategic ambiguity. The belief was that using a single currency would bring around economic integration without the need for political unity, which they didn't think they could get. But they thought if we're all using the same currency, we'll all have to get along, but we won't have to assume our political identities. In other words, we can still be Italians, we can still be Germans, we can still be French, but we'll be so unified that it won't really matter. Unfortunately, what we have found is that countries cheated. Instead, the Maastricht rules were flouted and the ECB ran policies for France and Germany. Part of the reason why Ireland and Greece and Spain and Portugal got themselves into such trouble is their economies were growing very strongly and they needed higher interest rates. But the two biggest economies in the EU, France and Germany, were weak at that time and needed lower rates. So guess what? France and Germany got the rates they needed, and the other countries got rates that were too low to be sustainable. Now, that happens here too. The Federal Reserve sets one rate for our country, but it is not the ideal rate for every part of the country. So, for example, you could have a situation where North Dakota needs higher interest rates right now. That's the last thing in the world Nevada and Florida need. So what happens is the Federal Reserve sets the rate mostly for the weakest common denominator, but then we use fiscal policy to address the other issues. So because there's really strong growth in North Dakota, they're paying more taxes, which dampens their growth and helps control their inflation, and that money gets transferred to the weaker parts of the state. That doesn't easily happen in Europe. In effect, what the problem of the euro is, that they are stuck without a fiscal authority. Here is the basic decision. Europe has now reached the point, the euro has now reached the point, that there is either one of two choices. Either you give up your sovereignty and stay in the euro, in other words, some group outside of your country is going to tell you what your budget's going to be, what your taxes are going to be, and what you can spend your money on, or you're going to leave the euro and do it yourself. Now, anybody that does anything with political theory will tell you that as a government that doesn't do its own budget is effectively a student council. They are setting rules about when you can go to the vending machines, but that's about the extent of their power. And this is a very difficult problem for the countries of the Eurozone. Right now, if you look at what's going on, the Germans have forced two new heads of state in Greece and Italy that were unelected. That's an amazing expansion of power. In fact, around our shop, we argue that the German finance ministry is accomplishing what the German Wehrmacht failed to do twice. They are taking control of Europe. Germany is pushing for fiscal control to be ceded to the EU, in this case, to the Germans. And it's a Hobson's choice because these are very proud countries. They don't necessarily want to see themselves becoming a local state of the Germans. Give up sovereignty, remain in the Eurozone, and face German-induced austerity. Keep sovereignty, but face massive inflation caused by reissuing your own currency. One of the questions I get a lot is, why don't the Greeks just leave? Well, the problem is this, that as soon as anyone in Greece figures out that, you know what, I'm going to wake up one of these days and my euros are going to become drachmas. And the drachmas are probably going to be worth less than the euros are. What's the natural response? Pull those euros out of the bank, send them to Switzerland or someplace else where they're safe. In fact, I read the other day that the Swiss banks have no lock boxes, no deposit boxes to rent out anymore. that folks have rented them all out. So that's the choice they face. And the other problem for the Eurozone is if one country leaves, it's really unclear if other countries won't be forced out too. Now, there is an elegant solution to this. No one's called and asked me about it, but the elegant solution is for the Germans to leave. If the Germans leave and they offered you the choice as a German bondholder of still receiving euros or receiving the new D-mark, most of us would think receiving the new D-mark is really a pretty great idea. But the trouble is, other countries are going to want us go with Germany because they like that credibility of a strong currency, including the French, who probably shouldn't. The French should probably stay with their southern friends, but they have their pride. So that's the situation that we face. And the important thing to remember is we're facing this not because of it's not an economic problem, it's a political problem, and it's a cultural problem, and it's a social problem. In effect, what the European elites tried to do 50 years ago was create a United States of Europe without the political process of creating a United States of Europe. It was a reasonable thing to do because what they were trying to avoid was a good thing. Not fighting another war in Europe is something they reasonably should have tried to avoid. However, this was a bridge too far. And now they're facing a really serious problem that could end up affecting the entire world. We like to refer to it as death by ice or fire. Okay, so what's this got to do with me? Well, we do a lot of trade with Europe. The blue line on the chart shows the combined total of U.S. Of imports and exports as a percent of total trade. We get about 23% of our total trade with Europe. This is another interesting one. When I broke into the business in the 1980s, we generally told people that buying European assets were a way of diversifying your portfolio. That their economy would be up when ours is down, and their markets would be up when ours is down. So it's a good way to diversify your portfolio. The top lines here show the yearly change in leading economic indicators between the United States and Europe. And you'll notice using the 10-year rolling correlation between these two, they are now virtually correlated. In effect, this is what globalization does. There is no diversification advantage for owning European stocks at this point. In our shop, we treat European stocks, we buy European stocks when we like the euro. And when we don't like the euro, we shun them. The great unknown for us is the transmission process of the financial system. Now, the banks tell us that their exposure to Europe is on a net basis very low. That word net is really, really important because that net means, well, I have this bond, but I've bought some kind of derivative instrument that will protect me from this value going down. Well, what did the Lehman and AIG experience tell us? Is that counterparty risk is really important. In fact, in this situation, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to calculate. So yes, they have low net exposure, assuming that if something goes bad, that the guy who sold them that insurance can make good on that insurance. It's the Lehman problem all over again. This chart comes from the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank, and it shows the level of stress in the financial system. Generally speaking, any reading above 1 indicates danger. It doesn't always result in a recession, but it does usually result in near recessionary conditions. This is the Greek crisis when it first emerged. This is the latest iteration of it. What's interesting about the chart is that when crises occur, they can occur very quickly. Up until about the middle of 2008, things were bad, but they weren't awful. And then this is weekly data. This went from bad to catastrophic in about 3 weeks. So when things go badly, they can go very badly very quickly. We do have one huge advantage. You know how we all complain about the banks not lending money? Cash as a percent of total bank assets is about 13%. It was above 15% last quarter. It's the highest it's been on record. This is as far back as our records go. It may have been higher than that before. But the fact is, after '08, banks have been holding an immense amount of cash. Now, the good news is, if there is a crisis, it ain't going to be as much like '08 when they didn't have hardly any cash. So, the good news is that they have more cash. The bad news is we can't get our hands on it. In conclusion, strategic ambiguity is a useful but incredibly dangerous tool because in the financial markets, eventually they call you on it. It's like that strategic ambiguity we had about mortgage-backed securities. Does the government really back these? Well, we might, maybe. And then we find out, no, actually they won't. It allows two parties with differing visions to move forwards toward a goal. But think about it this way. When the Founding Fathers created the country, they had differing visions on the power of the federal government versus the power of the state governments. And they left those unresolved until 1860. And then we had to resolve them with one of the bloodiest wars in our history. So strategic ambiguity is how we get things done, but it is a dangerous tool. Sometimes this ambiguity must be resolved, and this point can lead to very unpleasant outcomes. The world has enjoyed significant benefits from globalization. We have more stuff at lower prices. Millions of foreigners have joined the middle class around the world due to globalization. But globalization is also the reason Greece threatens global growth. Greece's economy is half the size of Argentina, which went into default several years ago and didn't cause nary a ripple through the financial system. It's hard to fathom that a country that small could cause this degree of trouble. Americans everywhere need to be aware for the potential of unexpected outcomes. This is our website. If you're ever in St. Louis, drop by. We have tickets to the world champion regardless.
If Europe goes into recession, how will that impact China and global growth?
Well, they're almost certainly going to go into recession. It would be very difficult for them to avoid it, and it is a significant negative for China. They have been exporting an increasing amount of goods there, and probably won't be enough to send China into recession itself. It looks like the Chinese have kind of seen this one coming. Actually, everybody's kind of seen this one coming, and they have already started to ease credit. They've already had one easing, and we anticipate that probably in the next week or so they will cut their reserve requirements again and probably cut them for most of the year. And they're doing this in part in response to an anticipated downturn in Europe. What they can't control is a unstructured default in Europe that would lead to a 2008 class financial problem, and that they can't really protect themselves. None of us can protect themselves from that previously.
We'll look for a question on this side of the room, and then I'll work my way over to that east side.
How long do you think it'll take for the emerging markets, into Latin America and the rest of Asia, to really recover, or to have their domestic economies, in essence, take over the demand that they're not going to get from Europe and the United States? When do you think they'll come out of this?
That's an excellent question. One of the or probably the more significant problem, has to do with our role in the world, and specifically the role of the U.S. dollar in the world. The U.S. dollar is the global reserve currency. And what that means simply is that other countries conduct trade in a currency other than their own. They conduct trade in dollars. So if they're going to conduct trade in dollars, they have to accumulate dollars. And the way that they accumulate dollars is by either begging, borrowing, or running a trade surplus with the United States. And most of them use door number 3. In fact, they have structured their economies to suppress domestic consumption and promote investment and exports, and virtually well more than 70% of its exports come here. And we took this role on as part of our Cold War strategy to defeat the Soviets. This is how we encouraged Europe, Japan, Germany to recover. Other countries figured out that if you want to make the middle class, just hitch yourself to the U.S. consumer. And we were willing participants in this, in part to the geopolitical realities we were engaged in, and in part it was a way to suppress inflation. We have now reached the point where it, on its face, seems very difficult for that process to continue. When I give these kind of speeches, audiences, as a rule, generally take a very sour view of the U.S. dollar in its future. However, it's always important to remember that currency markets are all relative markets. In other words, we value a currency based on some other currency. And right now, if you look at the four major currencies in the world, dollar, euro, pound, yen, it is kind of an ugly dog contest. And right now, we're the prettiest ugly dog. Doesn't mean we're good, and that's why gold is as strong as it is. These countries would have to make dramatic shifts in how they do business. They'd have to be focused much less on selling to us and much more focused on doing their own domestic demand. And the problem is, as long as the dollar is the reserve currency, they will still have an incentive to run a trade surplus with us. Now, fixing that reserve currency problem is something that's bedeviled economists for the past 70 years. John Maynard Keynes tried to argue that what we really need is a global central bank that issues a global currency. The U.S. Treasury Secretary that thought that was a really stupid idea turns out later was a KGB agent. But he fought that, and that's why the dollar became the reserve currency of Bretton Woods in 1944. And although the rest of the world has very serious concerns about the future of the dollar, there's no other country willing to play that role of importer of last resort. In other words, there's no other country willing to create a Rust Belt in order to fulfill their international obligations. And that's why the idea that, well, these emerging markets will start consuming more and they'll eventually take that load off of the world isn't going to happen without that currency situation being resolved. Because as long as they still have an incentive to run trade surpluses with us to accumulate our currency, they're going to continue to do that. They're going to structure economies in that fashion. Chinese, you'll notice, periodically talk about the need for a new global currency. To have a non-national currency take that role, it's either got to be something like gold, or you got to create a world central bank. And the idea of a world central bank passing any American Congress is a really slim odds. I don't think there's hardly any issue like that ever happened. So that's the position that we're stuck in. Now, if some other currency took that role. Let's say the Chinese yuan took that role, they took that importer of last resort role, then that would change. They would still be not picking up the slack, but the rest of the countries wouldn't, but China would be. China's shown no indication that they're interested in taking on that role.
The next question's in the back here.
How does energy resources fit into the geopolitical problems?
It's that has been a fascinating turn of events. One of the things that I used to do at A.G. Edwards was I used to do the U.S. domestic political analysis. It gets back to a situation that every mother understands, that if you're willing to do a really nasty, ugly job, everyone will let you. Fortunately, I have never been shot at or had my house set on fire or anything like that, and I tended to cover domestic politics. I try to be as nonpartisan as possible. One of the things that we are seeing coming out of Obama recently has been an emergence of what is being called an Obama doctrine. And you've seen recent commentary about changing our spending, military spending That's part of a change in foreign policy, and energy is part of that. A lot of talk right now about the Strait of Hormuz, for example. Iran, these sanctions on Iran have clearly started to bite because they have pulled out their most potent weapon to threaten the world, which is shutting off the Persian Gulf's oil flows. Interestingly enough, we could get by with what we get from the Saudis. We could replace out of our strategic reserves. In fact, with a little bit of effort, we could probably not buy any oil from the Middle East at all. For most of the past 30 years, the Saudis have been our number one or number two supplier of crude oil, in part because they wanted to ensure that we would pay attention to them. But about 6 or 7 years ago, they stopped doing that. And they started focusing on China, which is not unreasonable. China is going to be a big consumer of crude oil. What they failed to understand is that, yeah, China may be a big consumer, but we're the guys who ensure that oil flows. In other words, that the Iranians don't pick on them. And we may be reaching the point where we're about ready to say, this maybe isn't in our interest to keep the strait open. But the Europeans and the Chinese buy lots of this oil, so maybe they should do it. And I don't know if we'll go that far. We still make lots of threatening noises about that, but you are starting to see kind of an isolationist tendency in our energy policy. I'm convinced that the XL pipeline was canceled of environmental concerns, but because the administration wanted to keep that oil bottled up at Cushing, Oklahoma. It lowered our prices and improved our refining margins. And I still think it'll eventually be built because at some point the Canadians will figure out some way to get that oil out of there. But let me kind of frame it this way. We speak about commodity markets and oil markets in particular as being global markets, and they are. But it wasn't always the case. In the 60s and 50s and the 60s and even parts of the 70s, oil was contained within national markets. And globalization is a fairly recent phenomenon. And we could be entering a world where it becomes less global. In other words, you start to see countries hoard oil that have it, or hoard energy that has it. And I've been kind of wondering, is this the first snapshot of that potential future? I still suspect that if Iran tries to shut down the strait, that the United States will open it up again, because that's what we do. We're the global first responder. But I think what you're seeing coming out of the Obama administration is a recognition that superpower hegemonic role is becoming very expensive and difficult to maintain, and that we're going to have to be more judicious in picking our battles. And it may be a situation where this one isn't that big of a deal to us anymore, which has enormous ramifications, because we have really, since Roosevelt, have been heavily involved in the Middle East. And you're seeing in this president, not exactly a withdrawal, but a willingness to let the chips fall where they may. Incredible lack of interference in the Arab Spring. And at the same time, a realization that, we've seen our oil production rise. We don't use natural gas hardly at all in transportation. And we're seeing so much of it that prices are now down to around $2.50 an MCF. Maybe this is the moment where we start to see the U.S. disengage, at least in terms of energy policy. So that's what I'm watching.
Do we have another question on this side? What is your best guess as far as the resolution in Europe? With Germany, do you think that they will actually bail everyone out?
My hunch is, I think where this will end up, which is a little bit like looking at a young pair of parents holding an infant and saying, when they're 25, they're going to be great. Getting from here to there will be a bit of an issue. My hunch is that the euro will break up. That there are countries that are in it that it is not in their best long-term interest to remain in it. That being said, that process of getting out can be really ugly. And they're going to struggle really hard to stay in, even though the costs of staying in are really high. But I think it's going to be pretty much inevitable. One of these countries is going to leave, and it's going to be really difficult once one country leaves for some of the other weaker countries to stay in too. And that's why they're really trying to keep Greece in, even though it's pretty much their economy is unsustainable in its current form without the ability to float the currency. And I don't think the Germans intend to bail them out because they're afraid that if they bail them out, they'll be bailing out everybody. And the euro was a political tool, an economic tool for a political goal. And unfortunately, it's not going to work as an economic tool because a lot of the countries that were put in it to foster unity as opposed to their ability to work within a single currency system. But the problem isn't seeing that end game. The problem is, when does it happen? And how does it happen? And these things always surprise you. And I just think back to Barbara Tuchman's book about World War I, August 1914. None of the countries after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand thought they were going to war. They thought they'd mobilize and the other countries would back down. And then when they didn't back down, then they'd take additional steps. Well, they'll back down after this. And the next thing you knew, they were all war. I think they hope that, well, Greece leaves, but everybody else can stay in. It'll be fine. I don't think the financial markets are giving that kind of space.
We have a question over here.
Yes, I was wondering, and this may be a very stupid question. I've been hearing on television when I walk by it about something terrible happening in March. Do you know anything about that? And you can get this free recording.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, I have not seen the free recording because usually when you sign up for something free, your email box becomes loaded with all sorts of things. I guess about once every week or two, I get a query from an advisor. One of my clients heard about this. What do you think? And from what I understand, he's looking for some kind of major debt crisis that's going to occur. I don't know how he knows it's going to be in March. That seems like a Nostradamus type prediction. My oldest turns 21 in July. I'm kind of not looking forward to that. But, there's lots to be worried about out there, and there's lots of money to be made by fanning the flames of getting people to be worried about it and sign up for free things that eventually cost them money. There's lots of people you can read that will scare the bejesus out of you, and they're generally free. Stephen Roach, John Hussman, the guys at PIMCO. You can read those guys, and if that isn't enough to scare you, then by all means sign up for this guy. I've been in this industry a little over 25 years, as Wayne noted, and these guys are out there all the time. They've just got much, before we didn't have cable, so it was harder to advertise. They had to send you junk mail, and it was easy to get rid of it. But when they put stuff on television, it grabs you. There's no doubt about it. And I'm terrified to sign up with this guy because I know my email box will be full. That's how this guy's probably making his money.
Got a couple more questions.
Could I just ask you a follow-up question on the,
I think you've had your turn.
just if you see the euro dissolving, if it dissolves in an orderly way, maybe not a problem, in a disorderly way, I heard maybe a depression like the 30s. Could you comment on that?
The disorderly problem is that you end up with a banking crisis. Now, modern central bankers should be able to respond to a banking crisis. You just do exactly what they're doing now. You flood the system with money. The trouble is when you flood the system with money, what money? And the countries that are leaving, their central banks can print money all day long. I'm not sure any of their citizens are going to want to save it. Some of the best lessons on this really come out of Latin America. I was a country risk analyst in the late 80s, and in fact, I ended up at A.G. Edwards because I was helping my bank sell all their foreign bond or their foreign debt, and I realized they weren't going to need an international economist a whole lot longer because they didn't have any international debt. But what you tend to see is that these countries try to reflate their way out. I think Brazil went through 4 currencies in 1980 to 1992. And they eventually default. What makes this one tricky is that the Eurozone banks were all encouraged to buy the sovereign debt of all these lower tier countries. And now they got to figure out what they're going to do about it. Now, in theory, the ECB could simply buy all those bonds up, but then that acts as a bailout, and the Germans would be furious about it. The tools are out there to prevent it, but no one wants to pay the cost of using the tools. And the problem is, the longer you wait, the worse it gets. Ideally, what you'd like to see is that when they created the euro, they created it in such a way that you burn your boats behind you. And they need to figure out how to rebuild those boats. They need to figure out orderly ways for countries to leave and not implode their financial systems. And, if Greece leaves, their new currency would fall sharply, their interest rates would go up a lot. But their currency would make their exports and their tourist industry quite competitive. And that would help them on the road to recovery. If you look at the countries that defaulted in Latin America, they generally got better. They just have an unsustainable debt problem. And because the European Union dithered on this, they now have similar problems in other countries. If it's Portugal and Ireland, that can generally be handled. Spain and Italy would be tough. They're both very sizable countries, and a sovereign default of a country the size of Italy, you're getting into some pretty scary territory there. Now, it would make a lot more sense for them to just simply leave the euro and issue lira. We'll get paid back in lira. The Latin Americans would have never defaulted on their debt if they didn't borrow in dollars. But they borrowed in dollars and they couldn't get the dollars to pay us back. But if we'd have lent to them in their own currency in pesos, we'd have gotten paid back. We wouldn't have liked the currency we were getting, but we'd have gotten paid back. That's almost something I have to create. But there's a lot that could go wrong. And that's why they're kicking the can down the road, because they don't want to deal with the problem, and that's why we're watching it so carefully as a crisis.
I have one more question in the back here and then another in the center.
Yeah, I'd like to revisit just for a moment your comments about we may be more reluctant to intervene in the Straits of Hormuz. Take that one side and then look at our production side on the oil on the other, because we're going to have to get it somewhere. Which one's going to give first? Because right now we're getting additional production by fracking, which is not popular with the EPA. The pipeline is not necessarily held in high esteem to run that down from Canada, so additional production from Canada is limited. And we've got an administration right now that's reluctant about generating additional drilling permits out there. So what's going to give? Either we're going to continue, or I should ask it as a question, will we continue as a military power
This
through
is
the Straits and
jeopardy.
protect that, or are we gonna release some additional production?
My hunch is that you will see additional production release. Now, I still contend that we will probably, if Iran is rash enough to block the straits, we'll reopen it. We've been drilling for this for a long time. We'll lose some ships if we do. War games over the past several years have shown you don't come out of this unscathed. And that's why I think there's some hesitancy. My take on this administration has been, and again, I don't want to offend anyone out there, but my take on this administration is that the man we elected was somewhat unaccomplished, that he had not really done a lot. And in fact, he's very young. And he was figuring out what he was going to do as he went. And it's only been in the last 6 or 8 months that you've actually started to see some kind of policy emerge. And I think on energy, he talks a lot about green, but I think a lot of this stuff with the XL pipeline and the drilling permits is electoral rhetoric. If he gets reelected, I suspect he's going to turn the spigots back on. Fracking is really unpopular, but a lot of new technologies in any commodity space are unpopular. I did commodities most of my life, and one thing I can tell you about commodity production is it always disturbs something. I can remember 7 or 8 years ago the uproar about genetically modified organisms. GMO corn, we're going to have Frankencorn. You notice how that's just kind of fallen away. We began to realize that this isn't a whole lot different than what we've been doing for about 400 years. And but whether it's ranching, whether it's drilling, whether it's growing, there's always some concern about how they're doing it. And I wouldn't be at all shocked in another 10 years, fracking will be as conventional as what we do with horizontal drilling. We'll pay attention to it. But right now, it's new and it's scaring people. And this happens, frankly, all the time. I mean, we wouldn't have started drilling for oil if we didn't run out of whales. But we did that a while ago, and we liked killing whales for the oil. We got so good at it, we just almost killed them all. And then we had to do something different. And I could be wrong on this, but my hunch is that this president's foreign policy goals are not necessarily neo-isolationist, but they're much more trying to pick the battles and tell other parts of the world that we're not always going to be the first responder. And if this is an important enough issue to you, you should take care of it. And that's a huge change. It's an enormous change from what we've been doing. Will we do this in the Straits? I don't know, but I can tell you the Middle East policy has been much more hands-off than any president I've seen since I've been analyzing these markets. And I think it's the beginning of the trend. I think this is how he's figuring out who he is, and this is the direction that he's going. Now, if he is going to go that direction, he is, as you well put, has to boost domestic production, or you're going to have to constrain domestic consumption a lot more. And that may mean $5, $6 gasoline to do that. But it'll work. It'll work like a charm. It's like I tell people, it's no great mystery how to lose weight. You just move more and eat less. But if you go on Amazon and type in diet book, you'll be there for a long, long time. And same thing is true with the demand side of energy policy. You raise taxes on energy, you'll consume less of it. We have a special word for politicians who do that. We call them private citizens. And it's unpopular. But he could do that. I don't think he will. My hunch is he may do a little of it, but I suspect he will become more open to drilling and perhaps using natural gas and transportation, which to me looks like kind of a layup.
We have our final question in the center.
What? Is that all you guys got?
As I understand, over the last several years, with this European crisis in these various countries, Ireland, Greece, Spain, and so forth, has been the market realization that the debt to GDP levels are getting to a point that are very scary. And multiple of these European countries are approaching that 100% or greater level. And what I've been struck by is why we don't seem to hear about people getting really nervous about the U.S., where here in the last literally several years only, we've rapidly increased our debt to GDP. And I'm wondering, one, is there that direct connection with this European crisis with that particular ratio? And two, when does the worldwide financial market stop worrying about the Europeans and start worrying?
Okay. The first major difference, the first thing you got to understand is that debt to GDP, there's no magic debt to GDP level. Belgium's had a near 120% debt to GDP for a long, long time. It all comes down to two things. Can you service the debt, and do people trust your currency? Now, the problem in Europe was these countries had these high debt to GDP ratios, and they didn't have their own currency. They had a shared currency. And that shared currency meant that it's like a gold standard. They had to go out and acquire euros to service this debt. That means you have to either run a trade surplus with somebody inside the Eurozone, pretty tough, or you have to get money from the ECB or through a fiscal transfer. And that's what made the problem particularly acute in Europe, is that a central bank can monetize the debt in a country with a very high debt to GDP ratio, except when they don't have a central bank that issues their own currency. So that's your first distinction. In terms of our debt, to some extent, our debt problem is tied very closely to our dollar reserve problem. The whole world wants our dollars, and they are willing to lend us money in the form of vendor financing to get those. And why do they do that? Because they want to employ their own people. So effectively, we are the drunk and they're the liquor stores. They give us credit to buy their booze so they can move their product. Now, who likes the drunk, right? However, if the drunk goes on the wagon, liquor store's got a problem, doesn't it? You got something to sell, they can't sell anything to. These countries don't say anything about our debt to GDP ratio because they're complicit in it. They are more than happy to play along with this. Now, do they complain occasionally? They wish they had something they could buy other than dollars? Sure. What's it going to be? But there is no other choice. They thought it was going to be euros. That turned out to be a blind out. Yen, pound, those are no better. Effectively, the four major currencies I mentioned earlier are all lousy. In isolation, you would look at the policies any of these four groups or countries are following, and you would say, oh, that's a weak currency policy. But if they're all running at the same time, then you can't tell, except with the price of gold. You'll notice the price of gold has gone up against all these currencies. The other issue comes down to credibility. Do people think that you will be able to service the debt? And when your debt to GDP ratios get high enough, people start worrying as to whether you can. And then you face one of two problems. Either you face the constraint, you have interest rates go up, and you start to delever your government side of your economy, or you have your central bank monetize the debt. Now, there is a third way out of this that rarely gets discussed, but is probably one of the tools that will be employed. In the book, This Time Is Different by Rogoff, Carmen Reinhardt and Rogoff talk about this. The term they use is financial repression. We actually employed this after the Second World War. We had a very structured and regulated financial system that made it difficult for individual investors to buy anything but treasuries. I remember as a little kid, you could buy stamps and fill a stamp book up and get a $25 savings bond. We encouraged people to buy government debt through moral suasion and through the lack of alternatives, so they would fund the deficit at a interest rate lower than what a free market would lend. Now, I could easily see a situation where the government comes out for our own protection and forces every 401k to own 10% of its assets in government treasuries. We could force that on pension plans. They write the rules. There's really not a whole lot you can do to stop them. And it may be the worst investment you could make, but Jesus, the world's safest instrument. It's rated AAA by 2 of the 3 rating agencies right now. And something like that could occur, and you could end up seeing the deficit effectively paid down with very low interest rates, because the investors are the ones losing the money. Now, it's kind of, again, hard to fathom government pulling that off with such a deregulated financial system like we operate in. But it isn't out of the realm of possibility. And, you know, it's kind of one of those desperate times requires desperate measures, and don't completely count out that as an outcome. Most of the folks I talk to who are worried about this issue are convinced that it's going to be reflation, that the government's going to turn on the printing presses, and we're going to have huge inflation, and that's how we're going to get out of it. And it could be. I can tell you, I don't think you're going to have serious inflation problems unless you regulate trade. Unless you stop the free flow of imports in the United States, I don't think you will have a serious inflation problem. And I'm not entirely convinced how they're going to solve this. I think they're going to solve it with other means that are less visible.
Great. Bill, thank you very much for
Thank you.
sharing your time with us.